tutorial video, we're going to take a look at adding fog and light shafts to our forest stream scene. Our scene is not particularly foggy, but the reason that we want to add fog is for some aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective. When we look at our scene right now, it feels kind of flat, and what we would like to try to do is to introduce some separation between foreground, midground, and background elements. And in order to do that, we need to add just a little bit of fog. We're not going to make it an extremely foggy scene, but we're going to add enough fog to kind of imitate the appearance of the little particulates of water in the air that make things further away look like they kind of have a little bit of a blue tint to them. And this is something that's really popular in painting landscapes and that sort of thing, but it also helps in 3D video game projects like this where we're trying to separate out the foreground, midground, and background. So let's get started. In order to do this, we need to come over here to our Place Actors window, and we're going to go to the Visual Effects category and add a component called Exponential Fog. I'm just going to grab this and drag it into my scene, and you can see right away my scene becomes really misty and really foggy looking, and this could be an interesting look to go for, but it's not exactly what I want the scene to look like. It's the default settings here are just a little bit too foggy, and so we need to come over here and change some of the settings. The first setting that we're going to change is we're going to change the fog max opacity. Right now the fog can go to 100% opaque in the distance, and that's definitely not what I want. So I'm going to change the fog max opacity to 0.002, and that's basically going to get rid of my fog. But in order to introduce a little bit more fog, actually we can toggle the fog on and off here, and you can see that right now what it's doing is just like extremely subtle. In order to introduce just a little bit more fog back into our scene, I'm going to go ahead and set the fog density to 0.2, and what you'll see right here in the background is that now I have a little tiny bit of fog in the foreground, but if we're looking at the background elements, you can see that those trees off in the distance are kind of foggy looking, and so it introduces some really nice separation between the elements here close to the player and the elements further away. If we toggle our exponential height field component off again, you can see now everything looks really flat with it off, but then when we turn it on, now there's some nice separation between our foreground, midground, and background. And you can play with these other settings as well. One of the things that I like to do is to increase the start distance, and that puts a little bit of distance between the place where the fog starts kicking in and the player. So I'm just going to set this to 800, and that'll push the near fog out a little bit. You can see that the rocks and things in the foreground here got a little bit crisper. If I set it back to 0, you can see that the foreground elements are fogged, but if I set it to 800 again, and that further emphasizes that separation between foreground, midground, and background. This other setting here, fog cutoff distance, if I have a skybox where the fog is painted in, I would want to set this fog cutoff distance so that objects in the really far distance don't get fog. So for example, if I set this to like 80,000, you can see that now my sky back here is not fogged. But that could cause some issues, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it as it is. And we may come back to that setting. Okay, so that's fog, and it looks pretty good. Let's hit play and give our scene a little bit of a test run here. Just going to kind of run around our scene with our mannequin. This is a really important step to do because sometimes elements that look pretty good in the working viewport don't look quite right when you start running around with a real player character in your scene. But again, you can see that I've got a nice separation between foreground, midground, and background elements. There is one thing that I don't like that's happening, and that is I can see a little bit of a line where my fog starts. And that is happening because of that 800 value that I added in. There's a little bit of a hard line. And if anybody here knows how to get rid of that, I would really appreciate your input. I'd like to kind of soften that so that the fog isn't quite as extreme. I'll just put it like right here on this log. So you can see like halfway up the log, there's a little bit of a line where the fog kicks in. And as I move, that line moves. If you know how to get rid of that, let me know down in the comments. That'd be great. All right. The other thing that I want to look at today is adding, and I'm going to use a fancy term here, crepuscular rays to our scene. Sometimes these are also called God rays or light shafts. And I got the idea for doing this from a couple of people who suggested it in the comments. And also, if we take a look at our reference images for the scene that we've been using, one of the images over here has these really cool looking rays shining down into the scene. And I want to try to get something kind of like this. This was a really cool suggestion from a couple of people that made comments. And so we're going to try to achieve that in our scene today. Unreal actually has two different ways of creating crepuscular rays. One of them is a screen space effect, and the other one is using volumetric fog. So I'm going to show you how to use both of these today to add crepuscular rays to your scene. So the first thing that we need to do is select our directional light. And then in the settings, I'm going to scroll down to this area called light shafts. And if we turn on light shaft occlusion and also light shaft bloom, you'll see that if I look up here toward the sun, now I'm getting these nice light shafts streaming away from the sunlight. These are two different methods of doing light shafts. This one shadows areas that are not hit by the sun, and this one blooms areas that are. So this first one is subtracting light from the scene, and the second one is adding light. And we're actually going to use both of these. So you can see if I turn this off, I actually get more light shafts, and if I turn this off, you can obviously see the difference. So I'm getting these cool looking light shafts, and this may be a little bit too heavy. I think I want to tune this down just a little bit, and so I'm going to set my bloom threshold. Instead of 0, I'm going to set that to 0.5. Just to tone it down just a little bit. Okay, let's take our mannequin and run around and see what this effect looks like in action. See if we can take a look at the sun through the trees. And you can see that with the sun on the screen, if I have a tree lined up, I can get some pretty nice looking shafts shining through it. And I really like that, but the problem with this effect is that because it's a screen space effect, if I don't have the sun on the screen, I don't get the effect. I have to have the light object showing in order to get these light shafts to appear. And in order to fix that problem, we need to use the other method of creating light shafts, which is with volumetrics. So let's do that next. All right, in order to use volumetric fog, I need to select the exponential height fog element that I added to my scene earlier. And here's the fog settings that I was working with before. And what I need to do now is use this volumetric fog setting. So I'm just going to turn that on. And let's see what we get. So again, our scene is starting to look like pea soup, and so we need to adjust the settings so that things aren't quite as thick again. And so I'm just going to come down here, and for scattering distribution, this is the direction that the light gets scattered. So if my scattering distribution is set to 0, when sunlight hits the little droplets in the air, it's going to get scattered in all directions. So if I have that set to 0, that's basically light scattering everywhere. But if I set it to 1, what that means is the light is scattering only in the direction that the light is actually shining. So in my case, I'm going to set this to 0.7 because I do want some directionality to it, but I do want it to scatter just a little bit. Okay, probably the most important setting for controlling the thickness of this stuff is going to be the extinction scale. And I'm going to set this to a value of 0.02. And what you're going to see here is that it pretty much gets rid of this effect. So we need to set some other things to kind of bring it back and pull it more into our scene. Then the other setting that I'm going to set is this view distance. And this is how far off into the distance the effect takes place, and I'm going to set it to 10,000. And that's going to work nicely because I'll be able to see light rays far off into the distance in my scene. Now, I want to be careful that I don't set this too high. Actually, let's set our extinction scale back to the default of 0.2 again, or the default of 1 actually. And if we set our view distance to something really high, like 100,000, what I want to show you is that, I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there's kind of like this noisy movement, and that's because there's not enough precision in the depth of my scene to make the fog work with such a high distance value. And so you need to kind of tune the distance value. If you're looking at a map with a really far, like vista distance that you're looking at, you have to kind of tune this carefully so that you have enough distance precision that your effect doesn't break apart. I wonder if I add one more 0 here, if I can even, yeah, can you see all the noise that I introduced? That's just because there isn't enough depth precision in my volume fog to get it to work with such a high view distance. So in my case, I'm going to kind of compromise and set this to 10,000, and now I get some nice resolution up close, and it still has a fairly decent distance that it can go, but it's not pulling itself apart. Okay, I'm going to set my extinction scale back to 0.02 again. And when we set this, like I said before, it looks like my effect has gone away. And so what I need to do next is come back to my directional light. So I'm going to select my directional light, and actually on the directional light itself, I have a volumetric scattering intensity. And I can use this value to control what the intensity is of my light. So if we look at our light here, you can see that I'm not getting a whole bunch of scattering. I'm going to type in 100 here, and now you can see I've introduced some really nice looking God rays into my scene. Okay, cool. So that looks great. Wow. If I move to the side, you can see they kind of move along like that. That's really beautiful. I'm loving what that looks like. Yeah, I could do this all day. Okay, well, let's use our mannequin and just kind of run around our scene. And something happened to our lighting. Can you see how our rocks kind of have a white halo around them and everything's like really blown out and super bright? So that's pretty bad looking. It took me a while to figure out what was causing this, and we're gonna fix it. So you can see that as I'm looking at my mannequin and playing the game here, it didn't look like this when we were in the editing view, but now that I've got my mannequin in the scene, something has just been completely wrecked. And so we need to fix this. So you can see, like, right now my scene looks just fine. But when I switched over to my mannequin, my lighting is completely destroyed. And why is that? Well, if we come up here to build, and I drop this build menu down and pick build reflection captures, and yeah, now you can see that my lighting is completely destroyed. And that is happening because of a setting that we need to fix on the skylight. So let's come over here to our skylight. And if I come down here, you can see I have this setting called lower hemisphere is solid color. And that's off by default. But when I turn on volume fog, what happens is the lower hemisphere of my skylight turns white. And so when my reflections render, underneath the reflections are completely white. And so this rock here, for example, it's getting white light reflected from underneath, which just kind of really destroys the look of the scene. So I need to turn on this lower hemisphere is solid color. And I've got a color here marked as black, which basically is saying there's no skylight coming from underneath my scene. So I'm going to check this box, and you can see, boom, right away that fixes the problem. And now when I come into my scene and run around with my mannequin, all is well, crisis averted, and we can go on with our cool looking volumetric light rays shining through our trees with lighting that still looks realistic. Now this kind of effect is not for everybody, so if you don't want this kind of thing in your scene, that's totally fine. You can just leave it out, but you know, some people like this kind of stuff, so cool. We've got these beautiful looking volumetric light rays in our scene. There is one more little touch that I want to add. So let's get to a spot where we can see our light rays. And let's come over here to, and you know, like I said, with the volumetric scattering intensity here on the directional light, you can tune this to exactly how much you want. If I set it to something crazy like 500, that'll give me like a really stylized, juiced light rays, but we probably don't want to do that. Let's tone it down, go back to 100. Okay, the other thing that I said, like one more thing that I wanted to show you is the albedo color. So I can adjust the color of these light rays. And in my case, what I want to do is introduce kind of a golden glow and make this feel like a beautiful, happy, warm, sunny scene with some nice light rays in it. So I'm going to change my color from white. Typically white is the most realistic because the little droplets in the air are white and they introduce this kind of white light scattering into the scene. But in my case, I'm going to stylize it just a little bit and introduce some like warm orange yellow to the scene. Maybe not quite super saturated like this, but maybe come back toward yellow and maybe a little bit less saturated. Yeah, maybe something like that. All right, let's take a look at that. So you can see that really added some nice warmth to the scene, especially in the direction of the sun. So that's pretty cool looking. Let's try one more time to run around with our mannequin, and we can just kind of see what this is doing for our scene. You can see that it's added a whole new dimension of kind of warm, happy, sunny light rays to our scene, and I really like what the light shafts do for us as well. So today we've come a long way. We've added some really cool looking effects to our scene, and you can see, like, if I look at it like this, and if we select our exponential height fog element and toggle it on and off, you know, it used to look like this, and now it looks like this. So that's pretty cool. That's a nice effect. And like I said, completely optional, but you can try it out and play with it and see what you think. Anyway, I hope you liked today's video. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. We'll continue to work on this forest scene, and in each video, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but in each video it just starts looking better and better. So let's keep going on this journey together and make a cool looking environment. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next week.